Okay, fingers crossed that kind of worked. Hey peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is my list of 3 hard and fast sewing rules that I never break, and here's why I don't think you should either. If you have seen any of my videos on my sewing channel, you will know that one of my mantras is if you end up with a result that you like, how you got there really doesn't matter. Now, rules are there to be learnt, to be understood, and then, if you want to, broken. But I do have 3 hard and fast rules that I never break for any project, and here's why. First up, pre-wash your fabric. Now obviously there are some caveats to this rule, but the idea is that when you get your fabric in, it will have been treated with something or another to get the dyes to stick. If it's a natural fibre, it probably will shrink when you wash it for the first time, and the last thing that you want to do is spend a lot of time making something that you love and are proud of and want to wear, wash it, and then it's far too small for you. So pre-washing your fabric will allow you to get rid of anything that's been put onto the fabric to help dye stick during the printing process, etc, etc. It will also pre-shrink your fabric for you. Now some fabrics do shrink more than others. You can do test swatches. You can cut a 10cm square of fabric, stick it in the wash in the usual way, measure your fabric when it comes out. Some won't shrink at all, some will shrink drastically. I personally have a rule of if fabric comes into the house, I tend to show you guys what I have bought, and then it immediately goes into the to be washed pile. The Fwiff got the name Fabric Washing Fairy for a reason. He did name himself, I have to say that, he did name himself. But when I really got into sewing, there was a time where I was going nuts with my fabric purchasing, and the to be washed pile was quite large on quite a few occasions, and so the Fwiff was born. Nearly every site that you buy fabric from will have some kind of washing instructions listed for you. Some fabric shops even send out little cards with the fabric type, the amount you've bought, and any pre-washing or washing instructions that they have for you for the fabric that you've purchased. Personally, I put my fabric through a 30-degree wash with the detergent and fabric softener I will use when I come to wash the garment when it's been made up into a garment. Depending on which fabric type it is, I will then put it in for a hot tumble dry as well. If I'm ever worried about a fabric and how it's going to react, as I mentioned, I will cut myself a little square and I will do a test swatch of that through the wash and the tumble dry and see what the results are. I do this with every piece of fabric. It comes in, it gets washed, gets folded and put into the stash, and that way I know everything behind me is ready to go and be used for a project immediately without any other prep work needing to be done. Now there are a few caveats to this, as I mentioned. I don't pre-wash silk, I don't pre-wash wool, I don't pre-wash anything that has a dry clean only advisory on the website. With those ones I actually do nothing to them. Now some people will have their wool for making their coat pre-dry cleaned because the dry cleaning chemicals can affect the size of the fabric as well. Some of them can shrink the fabric. I don't do that, and I have never had a problem. Now I have had many people say to me in the comments section and in real life, "Oh, I never pre-wash my fabric, I just use it and everything's fine, I've never had any problems." And that is awesome. And as I have mentioned, rules are there to be broken, and you've never had a problem from not pre-washing your fabric, then you do you. And that's the whole point of this journey, is to find a way to do the thing that you love doing in a way that you love doing it. So it's a hard and fast rule for me, but it might not necessarily be so for you. But pre-wash your fabric. Okay, rule number 2, respect the grain. Again, rules are made to be broken, but this is one that I very rarely go against. All patterns that you will come across, all good patterns that you come across, have a grain line printed onto them, and you really ought to respect the grain, because the person who has made that pattern has thought about the way that the clothing is going to be fitting on your body, hanging on your body, what the grain line is going to do for those certain pieces when they get sewn together. There is obviously the straight of grain, and then there is the cross grain. I do sometimes cut on the cross grain, especially if I'm working with a border print or if I am working with a pattern piece that is giant, like my Sew Over It Eve skirt back. I have lengthened that thing by 4 inches, and I have also decided to cut it on the fold rather than with a seam down the centre back, which means majority of times the pattern piece placed on the fold of a 140 wide fabric hangs off the edge by this much. So I tend to cut those on the cross grain. If I do that, I cut the rest of the project out on the same grain so that I'm not mixing grain lines. Here we have some striped fabric. This is the selvage. So this is the lengthwise grain. This is the crosswise grain, and then we have the bias going this way. So the crosswise grain is the one that has a little bit of mechanical stretch in it. So if you're cutting out your pattern piece in the usual way, so that the grain line is parallel with the selvage, you will find that the piece that goes around the body has a little bit of mechanical stretch in it. If you're cutting your pieces out on the cross grain so that you have the grain line running perpendicular to the selvage, you will find that the up and down lengthwise pieces of your pattern will have a little bit of mechanical stretch in them, but the pieces that go around your body have less stretch in them, because this lengthwise grain is the stablest of all of them. And obviously we have the bias grain, which is the 45-degree angle, and that one is super stretchy, which is why pieces cut on the bias will drape and cling to the curves nicely. Lots of things are designed to be cut on the bias so that they skim and curve over the body nicely. They also give it a lot more stretch because the 45-degree angle of the fabric has a lot more stretch in it than the cross grain or the straight of grain. If you take a piece of fabric and you pull it like that and then like that, it'll have very little give. If you pull it on the bias, it has a lot more give. It's another reason that you have to wait for circle skirts or hems with bias in them for them to drop, so that you can level it, so that you end up with a nice level skirt at the end, because the bias in the fabric will stretch. I do get comments every now and again when I'm filming time lapses of me cutting out different pattern pieces, just saying, "Oh, you're not paying attention to the grain or whatsoever. Like, why? Like, it looks way more economical the way you're cutting it out." I promise you, I am paying attention to the grain. Some pieces might look like they should be cut one way, but the grain has asked you to cut it another way, and it's for a reason. So I promise I pay attention to the grain. One of the ways to make sure that you're getting your pattern pieces on grain is to use a tape measure. Prep for cutting out and cutting out accurately will give you a much more pleasant sewing experience, and also a neater finished garment at the end. So I take a lot of time to make sure that if I'm putting my fabric on the fold, that I'm getting it correctly on grain and that it's not a little bit skew with. This does take a little bit of time, but it's definitely worth it, and it has made the sewing experience much more pleasant in my opinion. And one of the things that I do a lot is eyeball it, and that bugs some people. I've been sewing for nearly 8 years now, full-time. I have got a really good eye for making sure that my grain line is parallel to the selvages or the fold line of the fabric that I'm putting my pattern piece onto. If you are worried, if you're not quite sure, get a tape measure and measure your grain line at the top, the middle and the bottom, and even more places if it's a longer piece, to the selvage or the folded edge of your fabric, to make sure that it's definitely nicely straightly on grain. You should end up with the same measurement at every point. Obviously that's a little bit more difficult to do with bias cut pieces, and bias cut pieces tend to be designed for fabrics that are slinky as well, so they're not the most fun to cut out. But again, getting the grain right on those kind of pieces will make the actual sewing experience of making whatever garment you're making a much more pleasant one. Ask me how I know. Rules are made to be broken, so every now and again I will completely ignore my own advice. For example, when I was cutting out the hunter tank from the Savannah viscose challis that I got from Lady McElroy, I had loads of that fabric, but I had some large scraps that I was trying to use up for this hunter tank. All those pieces are meant to be cut on the grain, and I fully lined that top because I prefer the finish that I can get from fully lining it. So there's 4 pieces of the pattern all the way around, so 8 pieces in total for a fully lined version of it. I managed to get 7 of those pieces on the bias, and there was a piece of fabric that was big enough to fit the last piece on, but it wouldn't have been on the correct bias, and I ignored that and I cut it out the best way that I could. It wasn't even on the straight of grain or the cross grain, it was 30-ish degrees at an angle. I chanced it with that top because it was a small piece, because it was going to be sewn to other pieces that were going to be the correct grain, and it was going to be sewn to an exactly matching opposite piece that was on the correct grain, and I thought it would behave itself. And it did. I got lucky. But it could have been a horrible disaster, because ignoring the grain can mean that pattern pieces kind of sit on the body funny and squiff and look odd. So that is why I respect the grain. My last hard and fast rule is iron as you sew. Do not cross the seams.
Don't cross the streams.
When I am sewing, I like to do as many processes as possible at the sewing machine before I will get up and go to the ironing board. The one time that I won't carry on sewing is if the seams are going to intersect. Say for example on this top, I've sewn the shoulder seams and I want to install the lining. So the lining is also going to have shoulder seams as well. I won't sew this seam here together until the shoulder seams have been pressed open, because you will get a much nicer, cleaner finish. Iron as you go. As horrible as ironing is, if you have to actually iron your clothes to be worn, ironing and sewing is so important. Actually, the only type of ironing I really like. Don't cross the seams. Iron before you sew. That for me is 100% hard and fast rule. The only time I break it and I have broken every single one of these rules apparently, the only time I break it is when I'm doing understitching. I personally like to do my understitching the minute that I have sewn the two pieces, like the lining and the outer together. I like to by hand pull the piece of work flat with the seam allowance towards the lining and stitch it and then iron, because I find that the understitching helps me get the lining pressed in a way that makes sure that it really does stay on the inside of the garment. I know other people don't do it that way. I know some people press the seam allowance towards the lining, then understitch, then press it flat. Again, you do you. Whichever way works for you. If you end up with a result you like, the way you got there is the correct method. But for me, I iron as I go, except in that one occasion. I have a few more rules that I live by, but these again are just my rules for me, and they may be something that you either agree with or don't. First up, iron your fabric and your pattern pieces before you use them. Don't use crinkly pattern pieces, don't use crinkly fabric. That extra 1mm from a crease in the fabric that you're cutting out, if that gets replicated all the way around the body, you're adding a whole ½ inch possibly of extra room that you don't really want, especially if you're making a fitted garment. So iron your fabric and iron your pattern pieces before you use them. But again, that's me, that doesn't necessarily have to be you. Don't sew over your pins. No, I'm not like Bianca. I haven't made a deal with my sewing machine, or if I tried to make a deal with my sewing machine, it's heard me say many times that I'm never having kids, so I couldn't offer it my firstborn in return for not doing me dirty when I'm sewing over pins. It scares me. Absolutely scares me. I have got a few, if I can find them. I won't be able to find them now, will I? Why when I want them can I never find them? Here we go. This is what happens when I sew over my pins. I end up sewing over the head of the pin and sewing the pin into the garment. I had to unpick that. I'm surprised it didn't break my needle, to be honest, and it looks like I've done it twice to the same pin. But that's definitely one of the reasons that I don't sew over my pins. I've also seen horrific things from other people when they've sewn over their pins and things have shattered and gone. I mean, I wear glasses so my eyes would be protected, but you know, I've heard horror stories. So personally, I don't sew over my pins, but again, that's my hard and fast rule. Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be yours as well. Another rule I have is use sewing scissors that are sharp to the tip. The amount of times I have seen people clipping into curves with the body of their scissors and not the tip of their scissors, and I'm just like, all it takes, especially if it's thick fabric, is for one just push on the scissors slightly too hard and you're cutting into all of your hard work. I like my scissors to be sharp right to the tip. These are my Kai shears. I've had them for a good 3 or 4 years now. The very lovely KK gave them to me. I've never had these sharpened and I've not needed to so far. I also have the smaller size of these scissors that Kai do. They're currently trapped in my desk, but they're the ones that I use to clip my curves. I will make sure that the point of my scissor is not going over the stitching line that I've taken all that time to put in. Again, ask me how I know. I've done this in the past. I had to repair I was trimming a French seam for a inseam pocket and I cut through the skirt and the pocket and ended up having to darn it, and it was for a customer. That was a horrible moment. So I will not use scissors that are not sharp to the tip, especially for clipping curves. But again, if you're braver than I am, or if you have more dexterity and control in your fingers, then you do you. And finally, for me, I tie off the end of my darts. I backstitch at the start of my dart, I stitch the whole way along, I stitch off of the edge, leave myself a nice long thread tail, do 3 standard knots, trim the thread down, press it and call it done. I am not correct. I'm just correct for me. I love that method. I use it every single time. I have seen many other people do many different methods for finishing off the ends of their darts, and at the end of the day, if you end up with a result that you like, your method is correct. Sounds like I've got a theme tune, doesn't it? What I'm trying to get at is it's great to learn the rules and to learn why those rules are in place, and then either stick by those rules or break them if you wish to. As I've said many times, if you end up with a result that you like, then however you got there is the correct method. I hope you've enjoyed learning about my 3 hard and fast rules that you should never break when you are sewing. Pre-wash your fabric, respect the grain, and iron as you sew. I'd love to hear in the comments down below what you think of my 3 hard and fast rules, and if you agree with them. Also, if you have any hard and fast rules yourselves that you always stick to for your sewing projects. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!